In many respects, the deities and demigods of the Dungeons & Dragons universe are the foundation that drives the cultures and behaviors of the many worlds and the beings that live upon them. The gods exist as much, perhaps even more, in the minds and writings of their immortal followers and their teachings than in any physical sense. But make no mistake, the influence of gods, even unseen, is undeniable. And at some level they mirror each of us, ambitious, flawed, and at times even petty. They scheme and vie for power, using their believers as pawns to punish their divine agendas across the material plane. In return, select deities bestow gifts and blessings to those who adhere to their teachings. Others are far less interactive, and ironically for some, their very existence rests entirely on faith. But with very little exception, each will make their wrath known to those who defy their divine mandates. And then there are the faction of gods and cosmic powers associated with death. And while the domain of the dead may seem pretty black and white, it is in fact far more nuanced than one might guess. The subject of today's lore discovery, the Raven Queen, embodies both the characteristics one might expect from any power associated with such a grim domain, but also holds a few surprises along with one of the more bipolar of historic profiles. Stark contrast between her initial lore and the beliefs and faiths of the more modern writings. Our journey will take us across two distinct world settings, from the scholarly archives of Candlekeep, ancient tomes of the Feywild, and obscure chronicles of the Nintir Vale, to sacred elven writings of the Seldarine, apocryphal tales from the nomadic tribes of Kalimshan, and necromantic scrolls found deep in the crypts of Thay. Absolute truth is as rare as the Nether Scrolls, but a truth can be found almost anywhere. And often that truth is shrouded in the cultural biases of mortal authors whose own personal beliefs color, shift, and even obfuscate the historical record to further advance a particular doctrine or agenda. In the case of the Raven Queen, her diametrically opposed and contrasting beliefs across the 4th and 5th versions of our lore only serve to amplify the allure and mystery of studying such a seemingly unknowable figure. Just keep in mind as we progress, the lore is often dogmatic, perhaps even fanatical, a common trait among the studies of most any deity or demigod. It is, after all, called faith and not fact for a reason. That said, the lore of the Raven Queen has seen both conflict and confluence, and some or all of the accounts and information I will share today are both accepted as sincere and true by some, while flatly rejected as heresy by others. The truth, your truth, lies with you. But with lore that is steeped in faith and devoid of evidential facts, one thing is certain: deity, entity, or even myth, the influence of the enigmatic Raven Queen across planes and upon the world is most certainly real. This is the 4th and final part in a Shadow series covering the related lore on the Raven Queen. Parts 1 through 3 are each dedicated to the Shadowfell, Sorrowsworn, and Shadarkai respectively. While it is not required that each volume be watched in order, there are significant lore details covered in those volumes, all closely related to the Raven Queen, that you may want to explore at some point. Links are below. If you enjoy and/or find any value in these long-form essays, perhaps consider showing your support over on my Patreon, where I have an ever-growing collection of resources to populate and enhance your adventures and worlds. You can check it all out and join for free with zero obligation. You don't have to spend a dime unless you want to. And at the very least, it's just a great way for me to interact with each of you. Links are below, and a sincere thank you to my supporters that make this video possible. Mortals fear death, not only for the pain and loss it brings, but for the uncertainty that lies beyond fate's event horizon. But all mortals die, that is the very definition of the word. To be mortal is to be subject to death, having a transitory or temporary life. Death is the inescapable reality that all beings, whether coward or king, must ultimately face their own death. It is perhaps the single truth on which there is very little argument. On the mortal time scales of gods, the Raven Queen stands as a young deity within the 4E pantheon of Dungeons & Dragons, but one that perhaps best captures the reality of this inevitable end. She stands as the Lady of Winter's chilling grasp, the keeper of fates, and the dispassionate shepard, safeguarding the dead from the blasphemy of undeath. Introduced in the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, the Raven Queen was the default goddess of death within the hopeful but ultimately flawed and failed Points of Light setting. Her domains extended to encompass both fate and winter, each element intertwining to form a broader representation of the end of all things. Despite her initial and unfortunate placement in that 4E Nintir Vale setting, the Raven Queen still managed to carve out a significant niche within the lore, her influence growing in popularity, no doubt in part to her expanded role in the world of Exandria as part of the successful Critical Role web series, and further solidified in its canonical status with the publishing of the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount. The result is the Raven Queen becoming one of the scattered, if rare, bright spots of 4th edition canon to be brought forward into the 5th edition, although this was not done without significant, notable, and in many cases required revisions to her origins, role, and overall portrayal that we will uncover and even attempt to reconcile. Unlike other deities associated with the domains of death and the dead, many of which offer promises of eternal joy, unending torment, or everlasting glory, the Raven Queen presents the uncolored, cold, and bleak truth of an undeniable end. She is not a goddess of evil, nor does she comfort with visions of immortal paradise. Instead, the Raven Queen is a deity who plainly represents the unvarnished, unbiased, and cold finality that death comes for all, with no exceptions or favors granted. This paints the Raven Queen as a symbol that is striking and, from a world-building perspective, somewhat refreshing in its unfiltered realism. Unlike other gods of the dead, who might be seen on either diametrical end of the personality scale, from the merciful to the vengeful, she occupies a space that transcends those biased and shaded moralities. This positions the Raven Queen of the 4th edition not as the more stereotypical deity one often associates with such a bleak domain, but as a shepherd of lost souls, a steward of the dead with a singular purpose of safely guiding each to its proper afterlife. However, fate, it seems, is not without its own sense of humor or an affinity for the ironic. One aspect of Discovery that is likely top of mind of any player, dungeon master, or world builder surrounds the Raven Queen's migration into the 5th edition lore. Specifically, her place, role, and interactions among the many 5e deities whose portfolios clearly overlap the Raven Queen's 4th edition domain of death. Chief among these is Kelemvor, the Judge of the Dead, a god that, despite any influence of the Raven Queen, still stands at the top of any 5th edition hierarchy of established gods who share a dominion over any facet of mortality. Today's exploration is intended to generate a proper, deeper, and hopefully complete examination of what is undoubtedly a conflicted tale, to provide some guidance that can be leveraged in your settings, adventures, and campaigns. To do that, to truly understand the Raven Queen, we must start by detailing her baseline, the 4th edition origins and role as one set of beliefs, to then compare and contrast with the more modern religious texts of the 5th edition. Together we will uncover what makes her such a popular goddess from the most unpopular version of Dungeons & Dragons lore. Only then can you decide which set of faiths or some measure of combined beliefs will best serve the Raven Queen's role in your world. Before we dive into those conflicted texts from the 4th and 5th editions, any proper expedition into the Raven Queen must start in a time and within texts that begin long before she appeared in any published works. The Raven Queen's emergence within the Dungeons & Dragons cosmology did not occur in a vacuum. Her character, while unique in many respects, most certainly draws upon the fictional influences that preceded her. One of the most notable of these will be familiar to any scholars of the Greyhawk campaign setting. The Suel goddess, Jas, often referred to as the Ruby Sorceress, is a goddess of death, magic, vanity, and law whose own echoes of lore from the world of Orth shares much with the Raven Queen. By examining their similarities and differences, we can better understand the impact of this legacy god in the conception of what would become the Raven Queen. To do that, we must start with some real-world lore. While you will find dissenting opinions regarding the exact level of inspiration Jas had on the creation of the Raven Queen, ranging from her being a full-blown reskin to a spiritual reimagining of the Greyhawk goddess. There are even accounts stating that early in the planning for the 4th edition lore, Jas was in consideration to be the 4E goddess of the dead, bringing her over as is, updated for the Points of Light pantheon. However, she was not a perfect fit for what designers such as James Wyatt envisioned for their new 4th edition setting, and so the idea of the Raven Queen was born, taking much inspiration from the Suel goddess while still retaining enough originality to stand alone, removed from the shadow of the Ruby Sorceress. But let's take the compare and contrast approach, and you tell me how much Jas DNA you think makes up the 4th edition deity of fate and death. Jas and the Raven Queen both govern death with a neutral focus, an approach that sits at an angle departing from the more traditional personalities and behaviors one expects from gods of such a domain. This includes perhaps the most stereotypical of death god traits, the signature mustache-twirling penchant for ambitious evil and cosmological domination. Jas focuses on the lawful transition of souls to the afterlife and emphasizing the importance of respecting those who have passed and the sanctity of their journey. Sound familiar? To that end, Jas oversees the rituals and laws surrounding death, ensuring order in the passage between life and death. In mild agreement, the Raven Queen's lore is concerned with the natural order of life and death, ensuring it is neither cheated nor feared. And she too takes an active role in the transition, also guiding souls to their destinies. While the Raven Queen too holds a strong reverence for the sanctity of death, she takes her respect for the dead up a notch, demonstrated by her open disdain for those who would seek to exploit death itself, something not openly opposed by the Greyhawk goddess. And it is here we find our most obvious divergence. While many similarities do exist between these two death goddesses, the strongest departure and the single takeaway would be their contrasting stance on the matter of the undead and the practice of undeath. While necromancy is accepted by and even exists within the clergy of the Ruby Sorceress, so long as it is performed in her name and worship, the Raven Queen, on the other hand, holds a particular contempt for necromancers and those who would tamper with the natural cycle of life and death. The Raven Queen, in fact, takes a stance of zero tolerance for any form of undeath, from the simplest of animate dead spells to the ritual of lichdom. The Raven Queen opposes any form of ceremony, rite, or liturgy involving the black arts of necromancy, seeing them as one of the most obscene and detestable of practices. This opposed ideology aside, the similarities between the two only provide the most circumstantial of evidence that Greyhawk's Jas may have in fact served as a significant inspiration for the creation of the Raven Queen as 4E's goddess of death. So I guess I buried the lead by not mentioning up front what I think can safely be said is confirmation that some level of inspiration from the Suel goddess was in fact incorporated in the Raven Queen's design and lore. We find this on page 11 of the 5th edition Dungeon Master Guide with the following quote: "The Raven Queen is akin to Norse pantheon's Hel or Greyhawk's Jas." And to be clear, even gods created from whole cloth are still woven into existence with remnant inspiration from the lore-rich, real-world mythologies and religions of ancient times, to the imagination of those creators and authors who draw from their own collective experiences and influences, and there's nothing wrong with that. Influences aside, the Raven Queen has a compelling, albeit conflicted tale to tell, and it starts with another deity who possessed far less reverence for the dearly departed. Cracking open the religious texts of the 4th edition, we first learn that before there was a Raven Queen, there was yet another god familiar to most Greyhawk lore scholars, Nerull, the god of death, whose lust and ambition for control of the afterlife would have far-reaching impacts and long-lasting influences on the deity that the Raven Queen would become. In a time before the gods had cemented their own control over the many worlds, Nerull emerged into the lore as a powerful but flawed mortal human wizard taught by the elven god Corellon Larethian. This was the Dawn Age, a period of enduring conflict where young gods and primordial elementals waged war over control of this mortal world. The Dawn War, a subject we've covered on this channel previously. Nerull had always fostered a borderline unhealthy fascination with the unknowns of life and death, and it was after one particularly gruesome Dawn War battle that he retreated to his study to seek answers to questions and perhaps even secrets of the afterlife. Nerull's first experiments were upon the countless dead from war, exploiting dark magic to find their potential use. He would soon discover that death need not be the end of a body's usefulness, that through a powerful yet perverse transformation of arcane energy, he could bestow a semblance of life upon a lifeless corpse, animating and in fact binding the vessel into service to do his bidding. Originally rooted in Nerull's motivation for the fallen to rejoin the war against the primordials, these earliest revelations are accepted in some historical texts as the first discoveries and the foundation for a magic unknown before this time, a school of dark arts that today we call necromancy. The Dawn War provided Nerull with an opportunity to test his profane powers. He believed that by creating an army of undead, he could tip the scales of that war in favor of the gods to defeat the primordials and earn himself a place among them. However, another deity, Aurum, whose expansive portfolio included the domains of life, death, birth, growth, fertility, and nature, looked upon Nerull's actions with complete disgust. To Aurum, death was a natural aspect of existence, a transition to be revered and not manipulated. Nerull pleaded his case with the other gods, but they all deferred to Aurum, and with each rejection, Nerull became more enraged, viewing the gods' warnings and rejections as nothing more than jealousy of his own burgeoning powers. Driven by ruthless ambition and likely his always present evil nature, Nerull plotted against Aurum, eventually ambushing and slaying the god, claiming the fallen deity's domains for himself. Now, if you're wondering how a mortal wizard was able to defeat a divine god, well, first know that you're not alone. It would be easy to just chalk this up to a contrivance required to support the intentions of the 4th edition lore, but that would also be a bit lazy. So I've given this some careful thought and some targeted research to create a scenario for this 4th edition lore being at least more plausible than it clearly presents upon first blush. First, let's look at Nerull's mortal beginnings in this origin story. The 4E lore tells us that Nerull was one of the first human mortal wizards, and he was taught his craft by a god, and not just any god, but the father of the Seldarine and top dog among elven magic, Corellon Larethian. These facts alone leave little argument that Nerull had an extraordinary and unprecedented magical foundation, especially for a mortal. Next, let's look at the time and the timing, as both can be impactful to his defeating of Aurum. This all took place during the Dawn War, a time when the gods were themselves young, not even able to control the world, as the primordials were by most lore accounts giving the gods all they wanted. Which leads to the timing. The gods, including Aurum, already had their hands full, and it would not be any leap of logic to say that Aurum was already weakened from the enduring conflict, and certainly not at full strength. Sticking with the timing theme, this 4E lore also clearly states that Nerull ambushed Aurum with an undead army he had already created. An army to defeat a god who did not have his own undead army, since we know Aurum thought the action itself as vile and blasphemous. Now, do not take my presented defense here as removing the weighty burden of the retcon itself, but I feel it is important to try and look at all sides and facets to provide some rationale and plausibility should you find it useful in your own world-building efforts. Nonetheless, Aurum now defeated, the other gods became enraged by Nerull's act, but blinded by their own ambition and greed were not above negotiation or even bribery. Nerull, as sly as he was ambitious, offered the gods all the domains of Aurum, all but the one he actually wanted, that is. Life, growth, nature, and fertility, these domains held no interest to Nerull. He freely gave them away, only asking to retain the domain of death and the dead, and to acquire his own divinity. The gods, eager to grab their own foothold in this nascent cosmology by expanding their own portfolios and influence, foolishly accepted Nerull's offer, setting the stage for his malevolent and cruel reign. With his newfound power, Nerull, following the same ideology trope found in nearly any comic book villain, decided this was not enough. He wanted to rule over all the gods, not world but cosmic domination, and the path to doing so would be paved with the souls of the dead. To this tyrannical end, Nerull made his home in the bleak dominion of Pluton in the Astral Sea, a location very different from his pre-forehistorical writings that place him in Carceri. In fact, most of what I have covered thus far would become retconned, disputed, and walked back in the 5th edition texts, but remember, we're covering the beliefs of those that follow the 4th edition writings. We shall cover the contrasting modern beliefs a bit later. Regardless of where he would establish his dominion, Nerull would hoard the souls of the departed, some tormented, some serving him directly, but most barely existing, imprisoned as his collection of powerless, ethereal shades. Consumed by an insatiable hunger and an impatience for his power, Nerull soon became unsatisfied with the natural order of death, what with its unpredictable, erratic, and slow delivery of the souls he craved. Nerull's continual slide into the depths of evil would find no bottom, so to speed things along, the depraved god began conjuring plagues, disease, and famine across all the mortal realms, and it was there he would find his future consort and the deliverance of his own end. It would be during Nerull's murderous and genocidal spree of plagues among the mortal lands that the Raven Queen, as the goddess would come to be known, first enters our tale. Once a mortal woman, a human queen, and a sorceress of notable power, like Nerull, she too was trained in the arcane arts by the same father of the Seldarine, Corellon Lorethian. Amazing coincidence. What are the odds? As the god of death conjured famine and death upon her world, the sorceress queen used her own formidable powers to oppose Nerull's tyrannical harvesting of innocents before their time. However, despite her own prowess, and one might think a fair bit of cosmic karma being on her side, a mortal, unlike Nerull, was not able to defeat a god, and Nerull's deadly blight counted the sorceress among the dead, their souls heading to join the Sea of Drifting Umbra on Pluton. Yet, even in death, the queen allured Nerull. Her soul stood out. He was drawn to her spirit, her strength, perhaps even her signature aura as a fellow student of Corellon. Nerull, using his deific control of undeath, and clearly having never read the literary classic The Mourning Bride by William Congreve, who famously stated that hell hath no fury, like a woman scorned, made the fate-filled decision to resurrect the sorceress queen and place her by his side, giving her the name Nera. Now his consort, Nerull, taking the water under the bridge approach, believed that together they could rule over the realms of death and eventually the cosmos. However, Nerull somehow underestimated his revived queen, the one he had previously murdered. Perhaps he was cautious at first, but Nera somehow feigned submission to gain his confidence and trust over time. Yet despite Nerull's promises and shows of power, his consort, unsurprising to all but Nerull, had not forgotten of his cruelty, nor had she forgiven him for her death or the death of her people. I guess love really is blind. She plotted her rebellion even as she played the part of quiet obedience. Patience, time, and knowledge soon became Nera's most deadly weapons. And as the centuries passed, Nera learned the forbidden secrets to wield Nerull's power that stemmed from the legions of souls he had unfairly and cruelly imprisoned. Then, in a fateful and shimmering flash of time, upon Nerull's domain of Pluton floating in the 4E astral sea, Nera, having mastered the ability to harness the forces of death, led the uprising that both freed the lost souls and in doing so fueled her own divine ambitions, ultimately ending Nerull's vile reign. With Nerull destroyed, the unwritten law of the cosmos says the Slayer assumes the mantle, divine powers, and divinity of the slayed. But this nascent pantheon of interloper gods would not be so quick to again release such a powerful portfolio to another mortal and the killer of a god. With the destruction of Nerull, the once mortal sorceress queen would absorb the domains of death and the dead, and herself become divine. This achievement alone marking only the third time in the known history of the multiverse that a mortal has ascended to the status of a god, joining Nerull and the lich god Vecna in such a claim. However, her triumph did not go unchallenged. The young pantheon of gods, witnessing the tyrannical evil that resulted from Nerull's unchecked rule over such a powerful domain, were unified in not allowing a repeat performance, ensuring that no single god should hold dominion over the full portfolio of death and the dead. And so, despite her rightful claim to absorb all of Nerull's divinity, the gods limited her bounty, allowing the sorceress queen to join the ranks of the divine, but cleaving away the powers over the dead, restricting her portfolio to only the domain of death. In this more limited role, the Raven Queen would possess powers used to safeguard passage of the recently deceased souls to whatever proper afterlife lay beyond. Nera believed she was betrayed by the gods, although one could certainly make the case that given Nera's own exploitation of the domain in her killing of Nerull, even for the right reasons, only bolstered the sentiment that the gods were justified, perhaps even wise, in their decision. Regardless, this created a rift between the newly divined goddess and the entire pantheon that not only exists to this day but would form one of the defining principles of her personality and behavior. And it is here that the dark goddess of death was born. Shedding the name Nera and purging the multiverse of her original human name, she became the Raven Queen, and self-exiled to make her dominion in the cold desolation of the Shadowfell, unfettered from the gods' interference. From the moment of her divinity, the Raven Queen became detached from a pantheon of gods she no longer trusted, refusing to take part in the endless deific conflicts and dramas. The one exception to this rule would be those rare times when an opportunity to expand her own portfolio of powers would present itself. And expand her portfolio she did, twice in fact. The Raven Queen's acquisitions of the domains of Winter and Fate, of course a reflection of her ambition, but also the often transactional nature of power among the gods. Never content, in fact resentful with the limitations placed upon her, the Raven Queen tirelessly sought opportunities to expand her own influence in spite of the gods. Her first of these expansions was acquiring the domain of Winter. Still in the Dawn War era, there is the tale of the winter goddess Kala, who sought to plunge the world into eternal winter. She rebelled against the primary gods and allied with many evil deities, including Grumsh and Tiamat, to start what history would later call the War of Winter. The gods, already mired in conflict with the primordials, found themselves now fighting a war on at least two fronts. Realizing they desperately needed a power capable of permanently ending a god's existence, in this case Kala, reached out to the Raven Queen. In exchange for her assistance to banish Kala into a deity's true death, the Raven Queen demanded Kala's domain of Winter as the price. The gods, with little leverage and in dire need of ending the rebellion, agreed, granting the Raven Queen her dominion over Winter. Much later, at least in mortal terms, would be the Raven Queen's acquisition of the Fate domain, following a similar pattern of strategic alliance based solely on her cold and calculated ambition. When Corellon, the god of the elves and father of the Seldarine, waged war against his treacherous former consort Lolth, now a Tanar'ri demon of the abyss, the Raven Queen saw another opportunity to expand her own influence. She pledged her forces, the Sorrowsworn, to Corellon's cause, the temporary alliance ensuring his victory against Lolth and her demonic allies. As a reward for her pivotal role in the conflict, the Raven Queen was granted the now vacant domain of Fate, which Lolth, as the former goddess Araushni, the spinner of fate, had previously held. Death, winter, fate, grim domains that are often feared but must also be respected. Each is aligned in a facet of the end of mortal life and the beginning journey towards the afterlife, whatever it might hold. The Raven Queen offers no comfort, reassurance, or warmth, only clarity and the reality of what comes next. Presiding from her palace within the Shadowfell, the Raven Queen has little need for allies and makes few enemies, unless a cosmological power treads upon her domains, which is where we find Orcus, the demon prince of undeath, and later Vecna, the lich god of necromancy, entering the animus of the Raven Queen, as each would seek at some point to usurp her domains and the knowledge she holds. Not only in defense of her own power and status, the Raven Queen despises both for their vulgar and blasphemous defiance of the natural order and their lustful practices of undeath. To her, their very existence marks her doctrine and threatens control over the natural and unmolested process of death. Despite the restrictions placed on her domain portfolio by the gods, in the 4th edition lore the Raven Queen was the central goddess of death, and she ruled from the updated plane of shadow, now called the Shadowfell. I have dedicated an entire volume to the lore of both the Plane of Shadow and the Shadowfell in part 1 of this series, so my comments here will be brief, but I would recommend you watch that video as it goes far deeper than I will here today. The Shadowfell was created in 1385 Dale Reckoning by the Dark Goddess and Lady of Loss, Shar, following the murder of Mystra and the events of the 10-year Spell Plague. This new plane of existence was formed by merging the Plane of Shadow and the Negative Energy Plane, and then absorbing a dark echo of the Material Plane, as well as the many demi-planes of Dread, which are better known as the collection of realms that include the Ravenloft setting of Barovia, among many others. While the Shadowfell holds other unique points of interest, the location relevant to our exploration today is a region called Letherna, home to the Raven Queen's seat of power and located in the far north. It is here inside a black ice citadel called Fate's Palace overlooking the bleak fallow where all souls must pass before they may continue their journey to the afterlife. As the central deity of death for the 4th edition Points of Light setting, the Raven Queen would preside over the final destination and afterlife of mortal souls, similar to the role Kelemvor now plays in the modern 5th edition texts. When a mortal dies, its spirit migrates towards the Shadowfell, drawn like a river's currents towards Letherna and Fate's Palace. Looking above, one can witness the constant and haunting ethereal drift of souls, arriving in Letherna to circle and swirl high above the spires of Fate's Palace as they await their fated afterlife. Here the soul is judged by the Raven Queen and is then sent on to its eternal destiny, good, bad, or indifferent, whatever that fate may be. The 4th edition lore goes on to tell us that this cosmic process is not perfect, and on occasion a number of unfortunate souls will have their journey derailed, these traveling spirits ending up trapped in a colossal valley near the center of Letherna called the Bleak Fallow. These lost souls then become the target for what the lore describes as interlopers from the other planes. These can include everything from infernal fiends to celestial angels, in what can be described as an edgier form by which the souls are claimed on the fugue plane, again drawing upon those similarities to Kelemvor. To me, this lore detailing the Raven Queen's rule in the 4E cosmos does a great job of summarizing what most every veteran 5th edition player listening has already come to realize. The Raven Queen was simply a much bigger deal in the 4th edition. because as we move away from the Nintir Veil of 4E and into the Forgotten Realms of 5th edition, the Raven Queen would be welcomed, not with open arms, but with cold shoulders and lots of unknowns. With the launch of the 5th edition lore, many foundational changes were made, the most striking of which was the decision to abandon the Points of Light setting altogether and designate the Forgotten Realms as the default world for core resources going forward. While this change would have implications that reach far beyond our discussions today and touch nearly every facet of the game's lore, the most relative to the Raven Queen would be her evolution, or more accurately said, her regression, that brought with it a host of changes to her origin, role, followers, even the certainty of her own physical form, or perhaps a lack thereof. Each of these changes reflect a broader design decision aimed to obfuscate as well as attenuate the prominence held by the Raven Queen in the 4th edition lore. These revisions were deemed necessary in order to take a goddess from an unpopular setting for which she was created to serve as a central figure and place her into a far more well-established, and some might say even overcrowded, pantheon of the Forgotten Realms. A pantheon that I would add already has many distinguished deities and demigods who touch, influence, or outright control the domains of death and the dead. Given this not at all insignificant environmental change, we find the Raven Queen's origin story in the modern lore is a considerable departure from her roots, trading a profile of strong ambition and self-agency, whereas a mortal she follows something very similar to the literary archetype of a hero's journey, which ends in the calculated coup d'etat to slay a god and become herself divine. For one colored far more by a blend of hubris, betrayal, survival, and maybe a sprinkle of nobility that results in tragic consequence and a more veiled and nebulous entity. This change would be just the beginning of a rewrite intended to reflect a far more ambiguous and, to be fair, required, but undeniably diminished role for the former goddess of death, now in these Forgotten Realms. And these revisions start from the very beginning. No longer the human sorceress consumed by the plagues of Nerull, we're now told she was a beloved elven queen, one of nobility, power, and elevated status. We learn that this grand elven queen, whose name was lost to or deliberately purged from history, also had her own quite substantial following. It is worth taking just a moment to talk about her people or her followers. These are the Shadarkai, and they're a race who have dealt with their own identity crisis, seeing much change since their own 3rd edition introduction. Their origin and lore is central to the Raven Queen, and they were fully profiled in Part 3 of this series, which I would encourage you to check out. What is relevant to our discussion is noting the Shadarkai were of human ancestry and the Raven Queen's most dedicated and loyal of followers in the 4th edition of the lore. With the modern tales of 5th edition, the Shadarkai see a near 180-degree about-face, reimagined with an elven bloodline, and who no longer worship or revere the Raven Queen, but they still do serve her, for which I will expand upon in a moment. It's important to note that across editions, the Shadarkai have remained pretty consistent in their outward appearance, dark and brooding, lots of ink and piercings, all of which is completely on brand. However, their characteristics, disposition, role, and as I just illustrated, even their lineage do make them one of the more retconned of races in all of Dungeons & Dragons. Additionally, it really is impossible to provide proper coverage of the Raven Queen and not also talk about her champions, the Sorrowsworn, who, like the Shadarkai, have also seen more than their share of change across their 3-version existence. These demons turned shadow creatures turned monstrosities are also fully profiled in Part 2 of this series in order to give them the proper coverage they deserve. The key takeaways with the most direct impact on the Raven Queen is that the 4th edition versions of both the Sorrowsworn and Shadarkai were loyal, even fervent servants of her will. With the Raven Queen's migration to the 5th edition, each of their roles and forms have changed drastically, with the Shadarkai being placed in the role of forced servitude as unwilling servants, and the Sorrowsworn being even more complicated, which is why those dedicated volumes, parts 2 and 3 respectively, exist. So please give those a look to gain the full 360-degree view of the Raven Queen. That said, continuing with the 5e origin story, witnessing the effects of a growing conflict between Corellon and Lolth, deities who represent the best and worst impulses of elven kind, this alternate history paints the elven sorceress queen as desirous to mend an elven pantheon fractured by a rift that had greatly divided the elven people. I would point out to anyone familiar with elven history, specifically the Crown Wars, which I've also covered previously, unity is a word often used but a state rarely found throughout elven history. Feel free to check out that video if you'd like to learn more of the elves' checkered past when it comes to racial harmony. While the nobility of her motivations are, at least in my view, somewhat dubious, we do know that this elven queen was not without her own ample hubris, as she would also seek her own divinity through her, quote, noble efforts to help the elven people. Perhaps even a challenge to the very authority of Corellon and Lolth, presenting her substantial followers as a third faction. However, this is all speculation of mortal authors, most of which are biased by their own racial agendas, as any factual knowledge of the Queen's truest intentions lies only with the gods, and they're not sharing. Still, the 5th edition Raven Queen's origins into a Forgotten Realms entity is presented through a process of a mighty ritual casting, which if you followed this series in order, you already know that ritual castings more often than not only lead to calamity, usually on an epic scale. Nonetheless, fueled by the devotion of her legions of followers who are said to have been excluded from access to Arvindor, the Elven Heaven, the Elven Sorceress Queen would enact her grand ritual under the premise and promise that in her divinity and through the restoration of the Elven people, she would open up Arvindor to all of Elvenkind. The lore does not qualify or define all of Elvenkind, and curious minds such as my own have to wonder, if she had been successful, would that not have completely reset the dark trajectory of the Drow? An interesting but ultimately fruitless thought exercise. This ritual casting in search of divinity brings us to the pivotal moments of the Raven Queen's 5e origin retcon, taking the form of a betrayal within. As the Elven Queen gathers the collective will of her people at the ritual's outset, a fractional group of 13 power-hungry, perhaps innately evil wizards within her ranks plot to usurp her power and perhaps also sabotage her ascension to godhood. Attempting to greedily siphon arcane energy from the ritual to selfishly empower themselves, this act of treachery occurring just as she approaches the cusp of her own divinity triggers the well-foreshadowed catastrophic chain of events. This disruption corrupts the ritual, of course, its powerful magic spun awry, twisting, warping, and ultimately dragging her and every one of her followers, the Shadar Kai, including those 13 wizards, into the Shadowfell's depths, now filled with the echoes and fragmented memories of countless lost souls. Vengeance upon those betraying wizards would ultimately come in their transformation into the creatures we know today as the Nagpa, 13 grotesque, vulture-like, and forever cursed knowledge seekers who will most definitely receive their own future dedicated exploration. Despite the corruption of a failed ritual, the Queen did achieve some form of divinity because while her physical form is obliterated, she is able to preserve her spirit from a forever death. She survives by using the last remnants of her near-divine powers to cloak herself in the echoes and often tormented memories of the Shadowfell, where eventually she is able to reform, creating the entity we know as the Raven Queen of the 5th edition. And it is that last bit of canonical origin lore that provides us our first glimpse into her reimagined behavior and portrayal that will define her existence and role moving forward, a dark obsession with the fractured memories of mortals and gods. But this leaves so much still unknown, most of which has been purposely veiled from any clear sight. However, that has never stopped us from our excavation of knowledge before, so let us continue digging until we reach lore bedrock. An aspect of the lore I find quite interesting in the 5th edition changes to the Raven Queen are found at the very beginning of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes profile, starting on page 58, from which I will now quote. The Raven Queen is trapped by her fascination with the past. She sits in her fortress amidst all the memories of the world, looking at the ones that please her most, as though they were glittering jewels. Many great wizards have attempted to understand her motives, but like a raven, she has always remained cryptic, keeping her cache of secrets just out of their reach." End quote. This, along with the rest of the chapter, provides us all the insight we need to determine what type of change was in store for the 5e Raven Queen. Make no mistake, the degrees of deviation between the 4th and 5th edition lore of the Raven Queen is profound. Across the board, the former deity of the afterlife and fate has been radically altered. No longer a goddess of death, even her status as a deity is now brought into question. Her former followers, the Shadar-kai, having been dragged into the Shadowfell, would no longer revere or worship the Raven Queen loyally as they did in 4e. Instead, they're now bound by a curse to forever serve her veiled intentions. Now taking the persona of the Raven, the 5e Raven Queen is fixated on the search for and collecting of shiny trinkets and baubles. These trinkets and baubles take the form of the memories and the many manifestations that they form, all of which are stored in a menagerie for her obsession and study. Along with these drastic changes, we also find that this new interpretation of the Raven Queen includes a shift from her seat of power, Fate's Palace in the 4th edition, to her new home, the Fortress of Memories, described as a twisted, maze-like castle where she continues to rule, but over what is mostly unclear. The 5th edition designers wanted the Raven Queen to be vague and mysterious with a lot of unknowns, so mission accomplished. One of the more compelling mysteries of the Raven Queen revolves around her own divinity. And what does the 5e text have to say on the matter? Well, as you would expect, it's vague and obfuscated as intended. Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes refrains from even using the words goddess or deity in favor of the more ambiguous, divine, entity, and godlike power. In fact, you will be hard-pressed to find any clear de facto statement referencing the Raven Queen as a goddess of the Forgotten Realms pantheon in the 5e lore. But there is at least one exception. Well, sort of. The Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition lists the Raven Queen as the goddess of death, but does so as part of the loose pantheon of Dawn Ward deities, more of a reference, so that doesn't count. No, the only official resource listing the Raven Queen as a 5th edition deity is found on the pages of the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, where she is the matron of death and embodies most of her 4th edition lore. But we must note that this lore is set in the world of Exandria, so that doesn't really count either unless you're playing in that setting. So the question remains, is the Raven Queen a goddess of the Forgotten Realms pantheon? The answer is no, probably not, at least canonically, but I hear she's on the market, open to being interviewed for the position in your world. The current 5e Raven Queen is an entity with godlike powers who still, at least partially, rules within the Shadowfell. She has her Shadar-kai servants and still finds worshippers and followers among cults such as the Raven Circle that pray for and expect her return to power at some point. Biased as they are, they still consider her a god. Do you? Over this 4-part series, we have unpacked a lot of conflicting, even confusing at times lore over what exceeds 3 hours of discovery, all directly related to the Raven Queen. Over the 5 decades and counting of Dungeons & Dragons lore, retcons are impossible to avoid. And yet my approach with these lore videos is to, where possible, provide some plausible context or creative world building that both reconciles the contradictions while also improving the cohesive narrative of the lore. So as I share with you the Raven Queen's reconciled role in my world, I want to highlight that I do this for my own world setting, my players and my table, and of course to share with those lore scholars that might also find it useful to copy, inspire, or just contemplate. While conflicts are inevitable, my intent for the lore of my world is to have some connective tissue where it makes sense with all existing versions of the lore on a given subject, all done in order to present, at least from a 50,000-foot view, some level of plausibility. Obviously, the more versions of lore that exist, the more difficult this task becomes. But having lore that is relatable to any version and that can be explained when asked may not completely remove, but can certainly minimize the immersion-breaking sting of some of the more stark retcons we've seen. And I would count the Raven Queen as among the more divergent, especially when looking at the totality of her lore that includes the Shadowfell, the Sorrowsworn, and the Shadarkai, who each saw their own not insignificant retcons in support at some level of a now abandoned setting. So my goal here is to illustrate what is the single strongest attribute of a forest worth of printed lore across the many cosmologies of Dungeons & Dragons. What is canon at your table is what your table decides. Okay, clear disclaimer of the obvious. The following is my canon for my world and in no way the canon of 5th edition or any edition of the game for that matter. For my world, I wanted to bring as much of the work done on the Raven Queen's lore from the 4th edition while maintaining the diminished role that I believe was a prerequisite for her inclusion in the 5th edition. Celeborn is the god and judge of the dead, and I am very happy the designers did not try to reinvent the wheel there. In my cosmology, the Raven Queen continues to reside in Letherna, the northernmost region of the Shadowfell. The 4th edition did a fine job of creating compelling and detailed lore on the Raven Queen, specifically in the core resource, the Shadowfell, Gloomrot, and beyond. While this resource is obviously written with her as the goddess of death, making some of the details incompatible with her new 5th edition role, I see nothing that prevents the entire region of Letherna still being present as her active dominion. In fact, I can make the case that this actually bolsters her new diminished role in 5th edition. In 4E, it was understood that the Raven Queen ruled all of the Shadowfell. While Shar had created the Shadowfell, she actually made her home in the Towers of Night located in the 4th edition only construct known as the Astral Sea. And before the Shadowfell, Shar did not reside in the Plane of Shadow as she made her home in the Grey Wastes of Hades in all previous editions. With the advent of the 5th edition, one can assume that as part of the cosmology changes that the Towers of Night either no longer exist, or more accurately, no longer exist in the Astral Sea. Perhaps they've been moved to the Astral Plane, to Hades, or the Shadowfell. This is all to say that in my world, Shar, as the creator of the Shadowfell, needed a new home in the 5th edition, and so her Towers of Night now reside in the Shadowfell. Shar allows the Raven Queen to remain, but her dominion is now limited to Letherna, giving her some clarity in the modern text, while still restricting her power in line with the designer's canonical intent. To further reconcile the lore of my world, in Letherna, the Raven Queen was not evicted from the Black Ice Citadel known as Fate's Palace. I mean, she built it, it was hers, so in my opinion, it remains so until a god or some other entity wants to come and try to take it from her. As for the 5th edition canonical maze-like Fortress of Memories that was, for all intents and purposes, a retcon of Fate's Palace, it too resides in Letherna, but is no longer an above-ground and alternate structure, as it resides under Fate's Palace. This is not only plausible, but in my opinion, logical. It's a maze, and I think it fits perfectly underground. In my world, the Fortress of Memories is a labyrinthine structure filled with the echoes of the past and the twisted remnants of memories the obsessive Raven Queen now collects, stores, and hoards. Her diminished role is explained by a couple of factors native to my world. First, simply her existence in the desolate plane of negative emotions has been marked by a deepening compulsion with the memories and emotions that fill the Shadowfell and relentlessly bombard her along with every other being within the plane's borders. Her 5th edition canonical obsession arose as her focus on the responsibilities as the goddess of death began to erode. Second, the Raven Queen of 4th edition was already very independent and in fact canonically held much resentment of the gods whom she felt betrayed her from the very moment she slayed Nerull. This, coupled with the clear negative impacts on her ability to function effectively as the goddess of death, gave the gods all the reason they needed to strip her of the domains of fate and death. So she was, in short, fired from, or if you prefer, simply abandoned her old role as the goddess of death. I have also leaned into the 5th edition lore that suggests, without outright telling us, that according to some scholars, the Raven Queen resides somewhere on the spectrum of madness and insanity, which only fuels her compulsion and obsession with memories. As a result, Orcus, the demon prince of undeath, who had long sought to usurp her power in the 4th edition, ceased his direct assaults, although Vecna now fills that void of conflict as he seeks to unearth secrets believed to be hidden within the memories she hoards and controls. Despite her relegated status in the Forgotten Realms, the Raven Queen remains a potent force within the Shadowfell, continuing to command the Shadarkai. However, as I covered in Part 3 of this series, while they still serve her, they no longer worship or revere her. They are unwilling servants, bound by a curse into forced servitude. However, on the mortal plane, numerous cults still exist in my world who anticipate her return to greater powers, suggesting she still holds some sway as a figure of worship outside of the Shadarkai. This places the Raven Queen's overall status as both vague and ambiguous, just like the 5e canon intends, now hovering somewhere in the range of a powerful entity or a demigod. Her once devoted Sorrowsworn, having undergone significant changes in 5th edition, canonically no longer serve the Raven Queen, as we've covered in Part 2 of this series. However, in my world, those 5th edition retcon incarnations are just another evolution of the species, born and shaped by the raw emotion and negative energies of the 5th edition Shadowfell itself. For my table, this new breed of Sorrowsworn, who are strikingly different in almost every way and instantly identifiable, have created a strong rift with the Sorrowsworn of old, who both still exist and serve the Raven Queen. In that role, they view these new manifestations as gruesome abominations to be purged. And those are the highlights of the Raven Queen as she exists in my world for my players, that allows for a powerful being with more agency in my own world-building efforts. In this way, she can still be an entity that can be leveraged as a patron, an antagonist, or even participate in some higher-level narrative machinations, while still maintaining the restrictions that were intentionally imposed upon her. You may have noticed that I only briefly mentioned the cryptic lore of 5th edition that only suggests the Raven Queen may not even often take a physical form, something that I dislike greatly and have abandoned for my setting. She may no longer be a true deity, but she is, according to the 5th edition lore, a quote, godlike entity. So what form she takes is not bound by anything other than her own wishes. The evolution or regression of the Raven Queen has seen her transformed from a big goddess in the little pond of the Points of Light setting to something less, something diminished in the enormous ocean that is the Forgotten Realms pantheon. In the transition, a deliberate decision was made to take her already fairly mysterious profile and pull the veil even higher. But this only makes her role and status more malleable, able to serve your table in a myriad of capacities across your adventures and campaigns. And that is, in my opinion, the silver lining, a byproduct of change that should empower the many dungeon masters, world builders, and lore scholars across millions of tables to welcome the Raven Queen to once again cast her dark and shadowy presence in their world. One of the primary objectives from which I write most every lore discovery volume produced on this channel is to bring something new, present a different viewpoint, and or share some obscure lore that you may not have known previously. And while the jury on exactly how successful I have been in reaching that objective rests with each of you, oftentimes I too have discovered knowledge or gained new perspectives. And that has perhaps never been a more relevant statement than in my research and production of this 4-part series. In the real world, we are all human, and as such we are subject to the favors and biases born and shaped by each of our own experiences. And it's no secret that I, like many, chafed and rejected the Points of Light setting, the world axis cosmology, the contrived timeline, and the incoherent mess that was the Outer Planes, all brought to us courtesy of the 4th edition. And while I feel much of the shade I have cast on 4th edition is justified, I also think it's high time for me to also call attention to those facets of its lore that have merit and are worth the time to explore and maybe even mine for use in our worlds. While easily being the most polarizing, 4E had some good, maybe even great ideas, existing as smaller, isolated concepts, characters, and stories that were unfortunately overshadowed and buried by those more egregious, world-shifting, and in my opinion unnecessary changes driven far more by corporate greed than anything else. But as I finished my own research for this Shadow series, I found myself coming to the surprising conclusion that when removed from the stain and stench of the aforementioned foundational changes, the 4th edition lore on all the aspects of the Raven Queen we have covered thus far are worthy of a second look. While I have always liked the Shadowfell as a more fleshed out and enhanced plane of shadow, really just a true evolution, I'm leaving this series with the opinions that the 4E Sorrowsworn are a better variant than the 3E Fiends or the 5th edition Abominations of Negative Emotion. And while the Shadar-kai of the 3rd edition have long been a favorite of mine, I must also admit that I'm viewing them through my own +2 rose-colored glasses of nostalgia. The fact is, I really actually think the 4th edition Shadar-kai were well thought out and had a near-perfect role in that setting, with the 5e variants perhaps being the version I find the least appealing to my own world building. And these lore bright spots are not just limited to the Raven Queen. The 4th edition story of Mal Harak is another example of good lore that unfortunately wears the albatross of the broader world and cosmological changes the version tried to force-feed. Nonetheless, it is an interesting story that resides at the obscure end of the lore spectrum, but one I enjoyed enough to create a dedicated video on. And then we arrive at the opposite end of the same spectrum, where we find the popular, beloved by some, despised by others, possibly overhyped, and definitely polarizing figure of the Raven Queen. And whether you like her or not, think she's divine or insane, it is undeniable that she is among, if not the, most popular canon coming from the 4th edition to be preserved and brought in to 5e. Not an easy task given all the 4e lore that the 5th edition has attempted to walk back, erase, or minimize. As we wrap up this series, I must say unironically that I am mostly satisfied with what was undoubtedly a difficult transition for the Raven Queen into our modern lore. The designers provided just enough contextual information to make clear that she's no longer the mighty and central deity of death. Yet they also sought to add plenty of uncolored space and unknowns for the creatively inclined to craft their own Raven Queen narratives. Some will call that a cop-out, say the designers took the easy way out. But you know what? Sometimes both can be true. And with the enigmatic Raven Queen of the 5th edition, the easiest path might also just be the most optimal. And that wraps up this 4-part Shadow series, exceeding over 3 hours of discovery. This, along with parts 1 through 3, should provide you just about every facet of available lore on the Raven Queen, her servants, and the Shadowfell from which she resides. If you've missed any of the previous parts of the series, I've added links below in the show notes. A special thank you to my YouTube channel members and my supporters over on Patreon who, through their generous support, make this video possible. If you'd like to support my work, it's a win-win by joining my Patreon, where I have an ever-growing collection of Dungeon Master and world-building resources. So check it out and join for free with no obligation. At the very least, it's just a great way for me to interact with each of you. Links below. And finally, if you think I earned it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.